Lucas Thompson had never been one for small towns, but Crescent Ridge, with its slow, predictable rhythm, had been the only place that made sense after the year he'd had. It was a place where nothing happened, where people didn't lock their doors and children still rode bikes down the empty streets at sunset. Crescent Ridge wasn't the kind of town that attracted attention, and that was exactly what Lucas wanted. His apartment sat on the edge of town, just a 10-minute walk from the forest that seemed to stretch endlessly behind the old factory district. He'd moved in 6 months ago, bringing with him little more than his camera equipment and a single suitcase. Lucas didn't need much, not anymore. Photography had become his escape. His work, though solitary, was something he could immerse himself in completely. And Crescent Ridge had plenty of abandoned buildings, forgotten places, and eerie landscapes that were perfect for the stark, desolate shots he favored. During the day, Crescent Ridge was quiet, peaceful, even. But at night, there was something about the darkness here. It crept in slowly, thickening the air until the streets felt like they were wrapped in fog, even when the skies were clear. And on those nights, Lucas found it hard to sleep. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the memories that refused to leave him. Memories of Emily, his sister, of her disappearance. He could still see her face, smiling in that carefree way she always had, moments before she turned away from him for the last time. 1 year. It had been a full year since she'd vanished, without a trace, from the small town they'd both grown up in. Lucas had searched everywhere, followed every lead, but it was like she'd simply evaporated. No body, no witnesses, just gone. The police had given up after a few months, but Lucas couldn't. He'd been the one who pushed her away. His work had taken priority, his trips, his long absences. Emily had reached out for help, for connection, and he hadn't been there. The guilt gnawed at him. It was why he'd retreated to Crescent Ridge, somewhere where the world was small enough to drown out the noise in his head, somewhere where he could forget, if only for a few hours at a time. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Lucas first noticed it. The smile. He'd been reviewing a set of photos taken earlier that week, a project for a local magazine on forgotten spaces. The factory had been closed for over 50 years, and he'd spent the afternoon shooting the decayed interiors. Broken windows, rusting metal beams, graffiti scrawled across walls that hadn't been touched by human hands in decades. The shots were good. Stark, haunting, exactly what he was going for. But as he zoomed in on one particular image, something caught his eye. In the corner of the frame, just beyond the cracked window, there was a faint outline, a blur, almost. It could have been a shadow, or a trick of the light. But as he looked closer, the shape took form, a face, and on that face, a wide, unnatural smile. Lucas blinked, pulled back from the screen. His breath caught in his throat. The smile was faint, barely more than a suggestion, but it was there, grinning at him from the corner of the shot, like it had been watching him the entire time. He leaned closer, fingers hovering over the keys as he tried to adjust the image, sharpen the details. But the more he zoomed in, the less distinct the smile became, until it was nothing more than a grainy blur. "Must be a glitch," Lucas muttered, leaning back in his chair. He rubbed his eyes and stared at the screen again. The smile was gone, or at least, it wasn't as clear as it had been moments ago. Still, the uneasy feeling it left lingered in his gut. The next day, Lucas found himself thinking about the smile again. Maybe it was the exhaustion. He hadn't slept well in weeks, or maybe it was just the strangeness of it. But as he went through the rest of his photos, he kept expecting to see it again. That grinning face in the corner of a window, hiding in the shadows of an abandoned hallway. He didn't find it again. Not that day. But the feeling stuck with him. Like something was watching, waiting, just outside the edge of his vision. A few days passed. Lucas kept working, kept photographing the decayed beauty of Crescent Ridge's forgotten corners. But every time he came home, every time he sat down to review his work, he couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Then it happened again. This time, it wasn't in a photograph. It was in the reflection. Lucas had been standing in his small kitchen, making coffee late one evening, when he glanced toward the window. At first, it seemed normal. Just the faint outline of trees in the distance, his own shadow reflected back at him. But then he saw it. A face, grinning. It was faint, but clear enough to stop him in his tracks. The same unnatural, stretched smile, the same shadowy features. He froze, staring at the glass, heart thudding in his chest. Slowly, he turned around, expecting to see someone standing in the room with him, but there was no one there. The kitchen was empty. Silent. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the room. Lucas shook his head, stepping closer to the window, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing, but the smile was gone, like it had never been there at all. "Just tired," he whispered to himself, but even as he said it, the words felt hollow. He hadn't imagined it. He couldn't have. It had been right there, staring at him from the other side of the glass. For the next few nights, Lucas avoided looking too closely at reflections. He kept his camera tucked away, unwilling to review his latest photos. He even started keeping the lights on at night, something he hadn't done since he was a child. But the feeling of being watched stayed with him, following him like a shadow he couldn't shake. One evening, just as the last light of day was fading, Lucas sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle. He reached for his camera, more out of habit than anything else, and began flipping through the images from that week. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Same old shots, rusted metal, broken glass, forgotten spaces. But then as he scrolled through, his breath caught in his throat. There it was again, the smile. It was clearer this time, more defined. Not just a blur in the shadows, but a distinct face, grinning from behind a cracked door frame. The eyes, dark, hollow, seemed to lock with his, staring straight through the screen. Lucas's hand hovered over the keyboard. His heart pounded in his chest. Slowly, he zoomed in on the image. The smile widened, sharp and unnatural, as if whoever or whatever it belonged to was enjoying the attention. And then, the lights in his apartment flickered. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the smile had somehow gotten closer, that it wasn't just a trick of his exhausted mind. For the first time in months, he found himself wanting to leave Crescent Ridge behind. The smile, whatever it was, seemed to be seeping into the corners of his life, filling the cracks where logic and reason should have been. But leaving wasn't an option. Something told him that it didn't matter where he went. The smile would follow. And besides, he couldn't abandon the last remnants of the project he'd started. The photographs of the abandoned factory district had sparked interest from a gallery in Portland, a big break he desperately needed. If he could just get through this madness, maybe things would go back to normal. So he threw himself deeper into his work, using the camera lens as a shield between him and the world. The more hours he spent focusing on angles, lighting, and decay, the more he could push the strange occurrences to the back of his mind. But no matter how hard he tried, the unease never left. The smile was always lurking, whether in the photographs, in the reflections, or, worst of all, in his dreams. At first, it had only been a shadow in the distance, a fleeting grin he could dismiss upon waking. But over time, the dream grew more vivid. He would be walking through the factory at night, the air thick with the smell of rust and mildew. His footsteps echoed off the cracked tiles as he moved through the maze of empty rooms. And then, in the distance, he'd see it. A figure standing perfectly still, face half hidden in shadow, but the smile always visible, wide, unnatural, and far too sharp. Each time, he would wake in a cold sweat, heart hammering in his chest, convinced that the smile was just outside his window. The turning point came one afternoon as Lucas scrolled through his photos, looking for patterns. It had become a ritual of sorts, studying each frame with an obsessive intensity, searching for any sign of the smile. He wasn't sure if he wanted to find it, or if he was trying to prove to himself that it wasn't real. But today was different. As he flipped through the shots, something caught his eye. In the background of one image, a recent one taken just outside the old Crescent Ridge post office, there was a figure. Not a shadow or a blur, but a person. Lucas zoomed in, the details coming into focus. It was a man, standing near the edge of the frame, partially obscured by the crumbling brick of the building. His face was tilted downward, hidden by the brim of a worn baseball cap, but Lucas could make out the unmistakable curve of lips pulled into a grin. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't remember anyone being there when he'd taken that photo. The street had been empty, deserted, like most of the forgotten parts of town he frequented. So how could this man have been there, standing so still, so silent? Lucas leaned closer to the screen, scrutinizing the figure. He looked ordinary: jeans, flannel shirt, cap pulled low, but there was something off. The longer he stared at the photo, the more the man's posture seemed unnatural, rigid, as though he were frozen in place. And that smile, too wide, too perfect. Lucas's stomach churned. It felt like the man in the photo was watching him, grinning at him, as if to say, "I'm here now." Trying to push down the rising panic, Lucas printed the photo and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He needed to get out of the apartment, clear his head. The air inside had grown suffocating, filled with the weight of too many unanswered questions. And more than anything, he needed to know who that man was. Had someone been following him, stalking him without him knowing? Lucas walked through the quiet streets of Crescent Ridge, his steps faster than usual. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the narrow roads. He kept his eyes ahead, avoiding the reflections in the shop windows, not wanting to see what might be grinning back at him. The library was only a few blocks away. It was an old building, one of the few places in town that still seemed to have some life left in it. Inside, the smell of dust and paper filled the air, comforting in its familiarity. Lucas made his way to the town archives, a small, rarely used room in the back, and began his search. If there was any record of this man, or anyone who might have been connected to the strange occurrences, it would be here. Hours passed as Lucas combed through the old newspapers and town records, his fingers growing smudged with ink. There were articles about Crescent Ridge's history, about the factory's closing, and even a few mentions of people who had disappeared over the years, but nothing about a man with a strange smile. Nothing that explained why he was showing up in Lucas's photos. But just as he was about to give up, Lucas found something. An article from 1994, buried deep in the archives. It was a small, almost forgotten piece, detailing a series of disappearances that had taken place in a neighboring town. 5 people, all vanished within a year, without a trace. The article mentioned that each of the missing persons had reported seeing strange figures, people who weren't there, shadows that seemed to follow them, and, in more than one case, a man with a wide, unsettling smile. Lucas's heart raced as he read the article again. The descriptions were vague, but there was enough to send a chill down his spine. Could it be the same man? Could this smile have been haunting others long before it found him? He copied down the information and left the library, his mind spinning. If this was real, if this smile had been following people for years, then why hadn't anyone noticed? Why wasn't anyone talking about it? Lucas needed answers. He needed to know if he was losing his mind or if something far worse was happening. And there was only one person in town who might know: Henry McCall, the old man who had lived in Crescent Ridge for over 50 years. If anyone knew about the town's secrets, it was him. Lucas found Henry sitting on the porch of his dilapidated house on the outskirts of town, a cigarette dangling from his lips. The old man's eyes were sharp, despite his age, and he watched Lucas approach with a look of mild curiosity. "You're that photographer, aren't you?" Henry asked, his voice rough. "The one who's been snooping around the old factory?" Lucas nodded, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "Yeah, that's me. I wanted to ask you something." Henry gestured for him to sit, and Lucas took a seat on the creaking porch swing. "You ever seen anything strange around here?" Lucas asked, pulling the printed photo from his pocket and handing it to Henry. "Like this." The old man squinted at the image, his expression darkening. He didn't speak for a long moment, but when he finally did, his voice was low and serious. "You shouldn't be messing with this kid," Henry said, handing the photo back. "That smile. It's been around longer than you or me, and once you see it, it never leaves you." Lucas's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Henry took a deep drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly before answering. "I saw it too, back when I was young. My wife, she saw it first. At first, we thought it was nothing, just a figment of her imagination, but it kept showing up, in mirrors, in windows, even in our dreams. And one day, she was gone, just like that. No body, no sign of struggle. Just, gone." Lucas's heart pounded in his chest. "And you think the smile had something to do with it?" "I don't think I know," Henry said, his voice shaking slightly. "That thing isn't just a ghost or a hallucination. It's something worse. It's been hunting people for years, feeding off their fear. And once it marks you, it doesn't stop until it takes you too." Lucas swallowed hard, his mind racing. If what Henry said was true, then he was in more danger than he'd realized. But he couldn't just walk away now. He needed to know more. "Is there any way to stop it?" Lucas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry shook his head slowly. "I've been trying to find an answer for years, but there's no escaping it. The only thing you can do is run. But even then, it'll follow you. Always." Lucas left Henry's house with a sinking feeling in his chest. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the streets of Crescent Ridge were bathed in an eerie twilight. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, his mind spinning with everything Henry had said. If the smile had taken Henry's wife, and if it had been following people for years, then what chance did he have? But as Lucas walked back to his apartment, something caught his eye, a flash of movement in a shop window. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. Slowly, he turned to look. There it was, the smile. This time it was clearer than ever, a face half hidden in the shadows, grinning at him from the reflection in the glass. The eyes were dark, hollow, and fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Lucas backed away, his pulse racing. He didn't know what to do, where to go. He couldn't run, not if it was true, what Henry had said. Lucas couldn't sleep. It had been days since the last time he managed more than an hour or two of rest, and the lack of sleep was starting to wear on him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it. The smile, always grinning, always closer. It had gone from a distant shape, a blur in his peripheral vision, to something far more real. He could feel it now. A presence lurking just outside the edges of his awareness, waiting for the moment he would break. He couldn't shake Henry's words, the old man's voice still echoing in his head. Once you see it, it never leaves you. Lucas had tried to run. After that final conversation with Henry, he'd packed a bag and driven for hours, leaving Crescent Ridge far behind. He hadn't cared where he was going as long as it was away, but no matter how far he drove, the feeling followed. The paranoia, the sense of being watched, and, eventually, the smile itself. Reflections in gas station windows, a fleeting glimpse in the rearview mirror, the unmistakable curl of lips in every darkened corner, staring back at him with that sick, knowing grin. In the end, Lucas had turned around. Running wasn't going to work. Henry had been right about that. There was no escape. So now here he was, back in Crescent Ridge, sitting in the suffocating silence of his apartment, staring at the flickering shadows cast by the street lamp outside. His camera sat on the table in front of him, untouched for days. It had become more than just a tool for his work. It had become a gateway, a way for the smile to find him. Every time he looked through the lens, he expected to see it, grinning back at him from the shadows. But tonight, Lucas wasn't interested in taking pictures. Tonight, he had a different plan. Jonathan Briggs. The name had come up in Emily's journal, scribbled hastily in the margins, along with notes about her own encounters with the smile. It had taken Lucas days to track him down, but he had finally found him. Briggs was an historian, a professor who had once specialized in folklore and urban legends. More importantly, Briggs was the only person Emily had written about in her journal who seemed to know anything about how to stop the smile. Lucas didn't know if Briggs could really help, but he was out of options. If anyone knew how to end this nightmare, it was him. The drive to Briggs' house was long and winding, the kind of route that felt like it was taking you farther and farther away from civilization. By the time Lucas pulled up to the old crumbling house at the edge of the woods, the sun had long since disappeared, leaving only the faint glow of the moon to light his way. Briggs lived in isolation, miles from the nearest neighbor. Lucas parked the car and stared at the house for a moment, trying to suppress the uneasy feeling that had settled in his gut. The air was cold, unnaturally so for this time of year, and the silence pressed in around him, heavy and oppressive. He grabbed his camera bag, not because he planned to take photos, but because the journal was inside, and made his way to the front door. The house loomed over him, its dark windows like empty eyes staring down. Lucas hesitated for a moment before knocking. The door creaked open, and a man in his late 50s appeared. Jonathan Briggs looked exactly like Lucas had imagined him, a man who had spent too much time alone, worn down by years of study and isolation. His face was gaunt, his hair thinning and gray, and his eyes had a haunted look to them, as if he too had seen things he couldn't unsee. "You must be Lucas," Briggs said, his voice rough as if he hadn't used it in a while. Lucas nodded. "I need your help. It's about the smile." Briggs didn't respond right away. He just stared at Lucas, studying him with a kind of tired resignation. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and gestured for Lucas to come in. The inside of the house was as cold as the air outside, the walls lined with books and old photographs. Papers and notebooks were strewn across the floor, cluttering every available surface. It looked less like a home and more like a place where someone had been desperately searching for answers. "How do you know about the smile?" Briggs asked, his voice low as he led Lucas into the dimly lit living room. "My sister," Lucas said. "She disappeared a year ago. I've been seeing it too, for weeks now. In reflections, in photos. I don't know how to stop it." Briggs nodded slowly. "I was afraid of that." He sat down in an old, worn armchair and motioned for Lucas to sit across from him. Lucas did, feeling the weight of the room settle around him like a thick blanket. "The smile isn't just a hallucination," Briggs said after a long pause. "It's not a ghost or a demon. It's older than that, older than anything we can understand. It's been around for centuries, maybe longer, feeding on fear, on guilt, on regret. It finds people who are vulnerable, people who have been marked by loss or trauma, and once it finds you, it doesn't stop until it has what it wants." Lucas's stomach twisted. "What does it want?" Briggs leaned forward, his eyes dark and serious. "It wants you. It wants to consume you, to take everything that makes you human and leave nothing behind. That's why it smiles, because it knows it's already won." Lucas felt the air leave his lungs. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was worse than he'd imagined. The smile wasn't just some lingering specter, it was something much darker, much more dangerous. "How do I stop it?" Lucas asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Briggs leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if the weight of the knowledge was too much for him. "You don't stop it," he said finally. "Not really. You can only delay it, distract it, but once it's chosen you, there's no going back." Lucas's heart sank. There has to be something, some way to break the cycle. Briggs sighed, his eyes full of pity. "There are ways to slow it down, old rituals, methods passed down through generations, but they're risky, and they don't always work. And even if they do, the smile will just find someone else. It's relentless. It never truly stops." Lucas's mind raced. He thought of Emily, of the fear she must have felt in her final days, knowing that this thing was coming for her. He couldn't let that happen to him. He wouldn't. "Show me," Lucas said, his voice firm. "Show me what to do." Briggs hesitated, clearly torn between helping and protecting himself, but in the end, he nodded. "All right, but know this, once we start, there's no turning back. The smile will know you're trying to stop it, and it won't like that." Lucas didn't care. He had come too far to give up now. If there was even the slightest chance of beating this thing, he had to take it. Briggs stood and led Lucas to a small, cluttered room in the back of the house. On a table in the center of the room were dozens of old, worn books, their pages yellowed with age. Briggs pulled one from the stack and opened it, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. "This is an old protection ritual," he said, handing the book to Lucas. "It won't stop the smile forever, but it might buy you some time. You'll need to perform it at the place where you first saw it, the factory." Lucas took the book, feeling the weight of the old leather in his hands. The pages were filled with symbols and incantations, words that made his head spin, just to look at them. "Follow the instructions exactly," Briggs said, "and whatever you do, don't let it see your fear. The more scared you are, the stronger it gets." Lucas nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had no choice now. It was either this or let the smile take him. The drive back to the factory felt longer than it ever had before. The night was heavy with fog, the road disappearing into the thick mist as Lucas approached the old, crumbling building. He parked the car and stepped out, the cold air biting at his skin. The factory loomed in front of him, a dark silhouette against the cloudy sky. Lucas grabbed his camera and the book, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with silence, the kind that pressed in on all sides, suffocating. He could feel it already, the smile, watching him from the shadows, waiting for him to fail. He made his way inside, the echo of his footsteps the only sound in the vast, empty space. The factory was just as he remembered it, decayed and forgotten. But now, it felt different, more oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on him. Lucas found the spot where he had first seen the smile, the broken window where the face had appeared in the photograph. He set his camera down and opened the book, his hands shaking slightly as he began to read the incantations aloud. The words were foreign, ancient, and they felt wrong in his mouth. But he kept going, his voice growing stronger with each verse. The air around him seemed to shift, growing colder, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was reacting to the ritual. And then, he heard it. A faint sound, like a whisper, coming from behind him. Lucas froze, his heart leaping into his throat. Slowly, he turned around, the book slipping from his hands. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure, the smile,